Hey, everybody. So, we're going to start agriculture. This is Unit 5. Some of you might really enjoy this unit. So, within this unit, we talk about two different things. We talk a lot about food and where it comes from, and different practices of farming. And we also talk about rural land use patterns. So, out in the countryside, we talk about some patterns that are different from, say, what you would see in urban areas. Okay, so I should have given you this yesterday. This is your KBAT, and I'm sorry it's super wonky form, but it does have a front and a back. So if you want to go ahead and put that in, or just leave a page blank before you start your notes. So we're just going to be doing 5.1 today, and you have two fill-in notes for that. So the one chart that doesn't have a standard at the top is going to be kind of continued, 5.1. Okay, so in this unit, we're going to talk about how agriculture is influenced by climate and environment and some human modifications. We'll also talk about two types of farming practices, intensive and extensive. Okay, all right, let's get started. We are not watching Mr. Sin.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, whenever you're
with that guy. Okay, so on this first part, I put in a chart for you. I want you to be familiar with this, so don't just like skip over it. But it's how agriculture is influenced by climate. And so I just wanted to quickly show you a map of climate zones, okay? So we have that polar region, right, that is closer to our poles. And then obviously in the middle, near our equator, we have tropical zone, okay? So in your chart, though, you need to be familiar with the areas that are in that cold mid-latitude and what grows there, okay? So those are going to be areas here, right, and here. And then you have your warm mid-latitudes, and that's going to be more like the southern United States and what grows there, okay, like vegetables, fruits, rice, right? And then the Mediterranean climate is going to be around the Mediterranean Sea here. So there's some very specific crops that just grow out of the Mediterranean. And there's a few other places where you have Mediterranean climate. And then, because California kind of has a Mediterranean climate. So be familiar with that. So big ones are grapes and olives, dates. And then grasslands, that's going to be around the northern Africa. Okay, so it's going to be really hot, and what we see there is where you have a lot of ranching, and then you have your subtropical climates and your tropical climates, and what grows around there, like coffee, tobacco, pineapple, that sort of thing. So just be familiar with what grows where and what climates. Okay, so that's this chart right here that is filled in for you. Next, we're going to talk about, and this is a great chart I forgot to tell you, is an AMSCO. So I would, when you are reading AMSCO, make sure you're familiar with that chart as well. That's a great chart. All right, next, we're going to talk about agriculture and how it's influenced by environment. We're going to specifically talk about human modifications. Remember, hashtag Unit 1. This is called possibilism, okay? So sorry guys, what are some things that humans can do to manipulate how we grow things? Okay, so you have there in your chart space, light, water, and so forth. So what I want you to do is just quickly put out to the side of how humans can modify, specifically with space, by clearing more land, right? So that you have more room to grow. And then for light, we have artificial light that we can grow, and that helps plants with the photosynthesis process. Then water. If you're not getting enough rainfall, well, we have, plumbing and irrigation systems that we can water plants that are deficient and not getting enough from rainfall. All right, and then nutrients. We have figured out how to add fertilizer to nourish plants so that they can actually grow more quickly. And then suitable temperatures, like we can manipulate climate now by growing crops in greenhouses and other buildings that provide a specific temperature. Okay, and all these are examples of going to be environmental possibilism. Okay, All right, I want you to know what economies of scale is because we use this a few times in this unit. So go ahead and write the definition there. It's going to be the savings in cost per unit due to increasing the level of production, okay? And the idea behind this is if you can increase, like if you're growing bananas and you can increase your banana supply, the costs at the grocery store are going to be less because you're able to produce more. So when we talk about agriculture and agribusiness, producing cheaper crops and finished goods than traditional farming, in part because they're producing at a really large scale, okay? Most of the stuff you buy at the grocery store does not come out of somebody's backyard garden, right? It's a massive farming scale where we see this. All right, let's go on to where it says some plants are constrained by the environment. So this is going to be, again, from Unit 1, we talked about determinism. So that's where you have the climate determining the outcome, okay? So I would know here to those bullet points, climate conditions and certain climates cannot be replicated. And at economies of scale, if you can't replicate, say, a Mediterranean climate to grow olives or grapes in, then you're not going to be able to make a profit, okay? And then that second bullet is, let me move my square here, is areas with these types of climate, say a specific climate like a Mediterranean climate, they're often used to grow only these crops at the expense of local food crops. So again, for example, in the Mediterranean climate, they are particularly with huge amounts of exports because that's a very rare climate that can grow olives, okay? All right, moving on to agriculture is influenced by now economic factors, okay? Am I going to be able to see this? Yes, I might have to do it like this, guys, because it was cut off at the bottom there. Sorry. All right, agriculture is influenced by economic factors, and farmers have to decide what and how to farm based on how much money they have, right? So you have 3 bullets there: cost of land, cost of labor, and cost of machinery. And so this is pretty self-explanatory, right? So I would just know that farmers are always looking for inexpensive land, right? So the more land they can get at a cheap price, the more they're going to be able to generate revenue and make money off that land, okay? And then cost of labor. Another thing is, right, if you have a crop that has to be hand-picked, then you're going to have to charge more for your crops because you have to pay individuals to pick that. So high costs of labor or the need for a lot of farm workers is going to drive up the price and make it necessary to generate higher revenue. And then the last is cost of machinery. And what I would know for this is if you do have to invest in machinery, you have to do that up front, right? You have to do that before you can actually start farming. But in the end, once you have that machinery, you'll be able to save money. Okay. Sorry, I hope you guys were able to see that okay. It's kind of cut off at the bottom. All right, we are on that next second page. And so you have 2 main types of farming. Okay, there's intensive and extensive. And under each one, you have specific methods that are used that are intensive. That's going to kind of umbrella. So what I want you to do first is I want you on your sheet here to give a definition for intensive farming and then extensive farming. Okay, so intensive farming is right here. It's farming a small amount of land with the use of large amounts of labor and money or capital, right? So again, that is intensive farming. So you have to have a lot of people working. An example that I would use for this is where you have fruit and vegetables growing, anything in vineyards, and that includes hog factory farms. Those are going to be examples of intensive farming. Now, extensive farming is kind of the opposite of that. That's where you have large amounts of land with very limited amounts of labor and capital. So you'll see a lot of machinery, big tractors being used in extensive farming. So examples of extensive farming would be grains and ranches where you're growing cattle. Okay, so those are the two types, and then we're going to go through and quickly talk about each methods of intensive and then each method of extensive. And you have another really great chart in AMSCO called Purposes of Agriculture. Okay, let's look at intensive methods first. Plantation, mixed crop and livestock, and market gardening. Okay, so I would try to, and I'll guide you through a quick definition for each of these and a couple of examples. So plantation agriculture, this goes back to where you had colonies. So for example, when when Europe colonized parts of Africa, right? And when we use slave labor in the United States, this is what that is. That's where you have very, very labor intensive. When we had Africans picking cotton, that was labor intensive. That's an example of plantation agriculture, and we often used exploitation in this type of farming. And so examples of this would be coffee, cacao, sugar. Okay, any of those will work. Sorry, I got to plug in my laptop. I'm losing battery. Sorry, guys. All right, next is going to be mixed crop and livestock. And this is also labor intensive, where you have farmers growing crops alongside their livestock. Okay, and so that's an example of mixed and livestock. And so if you have animals that are eating grain or soybean, that's what you're going to grow as your crop. Okay, and then market gardening, these are farms that specialize in specific fruits and vegetables, and a lot of times they're transported to like farmers markets. Some examples of this would include like lettuce, potatoes, even grapes, and a lot of these are harvested by migrant workers from other countries coming in to work. All right, that is intensive. Now let's look at examples of extensive. Okay, so we have shifting cultivation, nomadic herding, and ranching. Okay, so shifting cultivation is where you have farmers that are in the tropics and they control a large area of land, and they clear only one part at a time, clear out one part at a time to farm. Okay, and examples of where you see this is going to be a lot of rainforest is going to be burned and used for this, which is quite sad. And then a problem that happens with this is soil loses its fertility after a few years. So farmers have to start this process over. And that's where they're just growing one crop over and over and over. Okay. Then next is nomadic herding. Nomad means mobile, right? So you have herders that are moving with their animals from pasture to pasture. Okay. And so examples of this is where you have either cattle, sheep, or goats. Okay. And the last there is ranching, just like it sounds. Okay. That's where ranchers own a huge plot of land for grazing cattle. We see a lot of that around Colorado, and they sell on the markets. And this is very, let me go back here so that we can see. So ranchers own large areas of that. We talked about it. And then ranch land is unsuitable for farming, so land is less expensive. So what that means is that if you have a plot of land, like a lot of the land here in Colorado is not suitable to actually grow crops, so it can be sold for a cheaper price. And ranchers are going to be interested in that because they can have their cattle or their sheep graze on that. Okay. All right, guys. That concludes 5.1. Make sure you bring these notes in tomorrow so we can get checked off on them. All right, and we'll see you then.